The media seems to be coping and seething in the wake of the failed voice referendum, seemingly grasping at straws to try and find ways to justify why the Yes campaign lost, seemingly unable to comprehend why people didn't want the voice. They're now suggesting the people who voted no were simply too stupid or perhaps too lazy to understand the magnificent generosity of the voice. The latest talking point is that the voice got higher support in supposedly educated divisions or electorates, but less support in less educated ones, and therefore there must be an education gap that really drove the result in the referendum. Waleed Aly and the project wheeled out this line.
The biggest dividing line seems to have been education. So if you are in a seat that had high levels of tertiary education, a bachelor or postgrad, then you were at the very top end of the yes vote. And if you had the lowest levels of tertiary education, you were at the low end of the yes vote. And that's not to say people who are educated know what they're doing and people who don't have tertiary education don't. It's about the style of the message, I think.
Now, Waleed Aly, to be fair to some extent, was suggesting that it wasn't necessarily that people were stupider or worse in less educated electorates, they just hadn't been given the opportunity to become enlightened. Patricia Karvelis went even harder when she talked about the education gap between no and yes electorates.
The yes vote, if you look at it, has been achieved in places where voters have a bachelor's degree or have better than average wages, and where you find educated people who know, if you've got a bachelor's degree, chances are you know something about government, our structures. You've taken an interest in the kind of way these things happen, not because you're better, but just because you've got the opportunity to have done that, just to be clear. Like, I'm not judging people's achievements. It's just you've been able to find out lots of information.
Now, the insinuation is that people who were less educated simply didn't have the resources or the capability or the skills or the education and training to come up with a fully informed decision. The people who were less educated made a less informed decision in their mind. This is a little bit of a troubling conclusion because it suggests that the quality and veracity and weight of a more educated person's vote should really count for more than that of someone who has perhaps not had a university education. This talking point is rather insulting for obvious reasons. That is, in their mind, the voice was inherently better and should have succeeded, and the only reason it didn't succeed was people weren't educated, read-indoctrinated, sufficiently in order to come up with the quote-unquote right answer. The talking point, in addition to being insulting, is also actually outright absurd, and this is for a few reasons. Looking at the electorate-wide stats is simply inappropriate. In each electorate, there are more or less educated people, so to speak. In electorates such as North Sydney and Wentworth, there might be more people with degrees, but we don't know exactly how the people with degrees actually voted in those electorates. We don't know whether they voted no or voted yes. We simply don't have that information, because when you go into the polling booth, they don't ask you whether you have a PhD. Therefore, we don't know how they voted. Ironically, Anthony Green has actually tried to make a similar point about Indigenous voting patterns, when he was talking about voting patterns in Lingiari, which is an electorate in the Northern Territory that voted overwhelmingly in favour of no, but also has a rather high Indigenous population. He asserted that simply because there's a high Indigenous population doesn't mean that we can conclude that Indigenous people voted no or voted yes. We simply don't have that information per se, and maybe in his eyes, it would be better to be looking at remote polling locations. Regardless, it does suggest that you can't just look at electorate-wide summary statistics to come up with a conclusion. However, as we've seen throughout the campaign, consistency in talking points has not necessarily been a strong suit of the yes side. The second issue is that having a degree in history or business or medicine doesn't necessarily make you more qualified to discuss or opine on political change than someone with a trade or someone who hasn't gone to university. This is especially the case since many of the kids who would be living in those areas were corralled or pressured into undertaking a degree. As they undertook the degree, not because they're better or more informed or even necessarily paid attention to that degree, they undertook the degree because they felt like they needed to do so. And therefore those decisions to those electorates weren't necessarily in any way better informed than the decisions of people who didn't have a university degree. Third, having a university degree can render you vulnerable to the Dunning-Krueger effect. The Dunning-Krueger effect basically asserts that when someone gets a little bit of education, they start to think they're an expert and start to think they are all-knowing and start to overestimate the actual skill base in that area amongst other areas. So for example, someone gets a Bachelor of Arts and then all of a sudden thinks they are automatically an expert. A journalist, for example, might have a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Socialist Studies, possibly with one term of economics in first year that they barely passed. And then they start to feel like they're experts on monetary policy, interest rates, inflation, contract theory, and econometrics. But in reality, they might draw erroneous conclusions. They might simply look at summary statistics and averages and draw conclusions that fit the narrative they want to paint. Draw conclusions possibly just echoing what other journalists are saying. Or put differently, the mere fact that they did that Bachelor of Arts doesn't make them an expert in the area, but it makes them think like they're an expert. The point here is the degree might make a person feel as if they are more informed than they really are, and it is inappropriate for us to extrapolate from the mere fact that someone has a degree into thinking they actually know what they are talking about. Genuine experts, by contrast, shouldn't be lording over people trying to force them to accept what they're saying because they are quote-unquote expert. Genuine experts should explain their arguments, not tell people to accept them at face value. The fact that some of these journalists are going around telling people to accept as a fait accompli what they are saying is telling in and of itself. Fourth, these locations and electorates were certainly at least as vulnerable to cultish groupthink as other electorates, potentially giving rise to a bandwagon effect. The problem here is that supporting the yes case became seen as a sign of enlightenment, as emphasized by universities and big business and the myriad yes signs floating around these electorates. Therefore, accepting the yes argument became a social fact in the parlance of Emil Durkheim. People who did not accept the yes argument were othered, they were ostracized, they were seen as somehow less educated, perhaps seen as a little bit vulgar, perhaps seen as someone who shouldn't be part of the in crowd. Therefore, in an attempt to be accepted and to become part of that crowd, to become part of the social circle and location, people aligned with yes. And in so doing, the yes case became less about the referendum, less about the details, and more about signaling to people that you were part of that group and therefore were enlightened. That is, supporting yes simply became a signal of enlightenment regardless of what yes actually stood for. Fifth, these electorates had vastly more campaign material for the yes campaign, as evidenced by the councils putting up yes campaign material everywhere. They put up yes campaign flags throughout the CBD, for example. The no campaign was always under-resourced, but in inner-city locations, this was especially evident as the yes camp was boosted by the councils themselves, boosted by the universities, boosted by the power bodies in those locations. This creates a salience effect and an availability cascade. Or put differently, the yes camp becomes so much more front of mind, so much more salient in other words, that people start to believe that is perhaps the true campaign. People start to actually recognize the yes campaign and start to become more and more familiar with it, thinking that it identifies with their location. Furthermore, the increased repetition can make these cases appear to be more pertinent, even though they don't actually have any more credibility or basis than the no campaign, which is simply less resourced. In turn, this creates the appearance of a false consensus. If you only see the yes campaign, you start to believe that the yes campaign is carrying the argument. You start to believe that everyone believes in the yes campaign because that's the only side that has the window stickers, the only side that has the flags, the only side that has the posters in the windows. Because the no campaign was so under-resourced, and because people were concerned about actually supporting the no campaign in public, it created the appearance there was actually a consensus behind the yes campaign, especially in these inner-city locations. Therefore, people started to believe that the no campaign was inherently flawed, and that everyone believed the yes campaign, therefore it must be correct. As a result, a whole lot of behavioural biases could easily have converged on these electorates, thereby giving rise to the result that we saw. Or put differently, the reason the educated electorates were voting yes wasn't because they were more educated, it wasn't because they were more informed, it wasn't because they were more worldly or more wise. It was because there were these other behavioural biases at play that could have caused people to vote yes, believing the yes campaign was the true campaign, the correct campaign, and indeed had the consensus behind it, when in fact it didn't really do so. And this is in addition to the Dunning-Krueger effect that I just talked about. The argument is also concerning and infuriating for people who have degrees and voted no. It paints us as outliers and renegades, as people who really don't belong to that so-called in-group, that in their eyes is the enlightened group. This is asinine. I have a PhD and I voted no. I know many people with PhDs who voted no. I know doctors and lawyers who voted no. But what I do resent is some of these commentators pretending to speak for all quote-unquote educated people, as if they are the voice of enlightenment, as if they know what the true consensus is. But this creates a false consensus and implies that anyone who has a degree who didn't vote yes ought to be ostracized. It also makes us all look like jackasses. It does this because it makes us look like arrogant idiots. Arrogant idiots who try to lord over other people pretending that if you don't have a degree, you are somehow less informed. People who are genuine experts don't act that way. But those are my thoughts about the asinine argument that draws a line between education and the results in the referendum. Let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below.